Motivating rhythm of life. Motivating rhythm of life with a healing rhythmic synergy. Motivating rhythm of life. Motivating rhythm of life with a healing rhythmic synergy.
So, we saw how psychedelia revolutionized both white and black pop music, and how white rock and black funk sprouted from this revolution in many directions, until finally they lost connection to psychedelia, and also lost the link that they had to each other. But beneath them, another musical culture was growing, a culture that kept the psychedelic spark alive, and also maintained the ideology of blending different ethnicities. Eventually, this culture will bring these values back to the forefront. In other words, this culture stayed faithful to the original spirit of rock, soul, and funk. And yet, it was maligned by the fans of all of these musical cultures. Until now, we saw things through the perspective of rock and funk. In this chapter, we shall give disco the respect that it deserves. The origins of disco are, of course, in the discotheque, a French word which means a library of records. After World War II, a few pioneers came up with the original idea that you don't need a live band to make people dance, and they formed clubs in which the disc jockey would play records, one after the other. In the jazz years, records were seen as inferior to live performances, so discotheques weren't very popular. But when rock and roll came along, and determined that every record was a piece of unique sound that was concocted in the studio, using means that were not always possible to replicate on stage, discotheques began to gain reputation. In the beginning of the 60s, the flamboyant mods made discotheques their favorite hanging place, a place where there was no live band to take the attention away from them. And when the psychedelic revolution arrived in 1966, the discotheques were one of the main arenas where it took place. The discotheques could provide the entire experience, blending visions, colors, sparks, and sounds, suitable for the acid-drenched minds of the dancers. The technological means grew ever more sophisticated, and the experience became ever more enchanting. But then, as we have seen, psychedelia moved away from dancing, and rock started to perceive itself as serious music, music that you need to sit down and listen to. The hippies drew away from the discotheques and preferred to listen to music out in the open fields. The discotheques had to adjust and find other clients, and some catered to a specific crowd, becoming closed worlds in which you could hang out with people who were like you. The main group of people who found sanctuary in discotheques were the LGBT community. The LGBT community in 1960s America was still underground. The medical world still regarded them as mentally ill, society still ostracized them, and the law still forbade oral and anal sex, rules that were never enforced on straight people, but gave the authorities grounds to persecute the gays. The discotheques and gay bars were the only place where they could express themselves, displaying their unorthodox sexuality and camp style, and be accepted as they are. Still, the police used to harass them and raid these places. And in 1969 came the famous Stonewall incident, when the gay patrons of the Stonewall Inn reacted to a police raid with violence and conducted a long fight with the authorities. This is considered the moment in which the gay pride movement began, the moment in which the revolutionary spirit of the 60s swept the LGBT community as well. It led to a lot of political activism, which had some significant achievements. But this activity was also tainted with the radicalism of the time, which arguably did more harm than good. Meanwhile, under the surface, in the underground discotheques, a much more significant movement was taking place. A movement that was based on love, and was destined to change the world and its attitude towards the community. The gay discos of the early 70s were the place where the original hippie spirit was preserved. It was a place where people congregated to express their love for each other, a love that traversed boundaries of ethnicity and origin, and also a place where the sexual revolution kept on happening, as in the darkness of the discotheques, people could have the sexual relations that the world did not allow them to have. These discos also kept providing the ultimate multimedia experience, mixed with a lot of erotica and camp. But, a lot more resoundingly, these discotheques were also the birthplace of a musical revolution, which shifted the focus from the record to the DJ. Until then, disc jockeys saw their job as serving the crowd, and would play the popular records of the day or take requests from the dancers. In the Manhattan discotheques of the early 70s, several DJs took a different approach. The DJ predetermines what he's about to play that night, and he uses the records to weave a story, take the dancers on a journey. The DJ becomes the creative artist, who puts records together to create an artistic piece each night, lasting many hours. Instead of just playing hits, the DJ looks for unknown records that will surprise the crowd, and combines them with the more well-known records, keeping the culture fresh and regenerative. These DJs developed new techniques, like switching from one record to the next while keeping the beat, or playing two records simultaneously, but taking only the rhythm section from one and only the singing and leading instruments from the other. This enabled them to create a salad with a completely new taste, which expressed the unique spirit of the community. The basis of disco was the funky soul of the 70s. As a culture based on sexual and spiritual unity, the rhythmic, sexy funk was the thing that moved the dancers' bodies, while the soulful singing lifted their spirit to the heavens, expressing their will to be recognized as humans with rights. Into that, the DJs weaved hippie anthems of peace and love, hot Latin and African grooves, mind-blowing rock guitars, and overwhelming technological effects. The result was a funkier and sexier version of the acid parties, music that helped you move your legs while your consciousness was drenched in stimuli and floating in a mystical haze. While the music of the early 70s broke away from the psychedelic unity and drifted in different directions, the disco DJs put them all back together to create something different than psychedelia, but no less powerful. Disco culture remained underground throughout the first half of the 70s, and gradually drew other minorities, blacks, Italians and Hispanics. Slowly, the effect started to seep through into the mainstream. Some of the unknown records that the DJs unearthed and played in the disco started to be played on the radio as well, and DJs also began to use their techniques to release remixes of records, in which they made them more disco. That is, longer, with accentuated steady rhythm, and with more technological manipulations. Eventually, musicians realized that this is a new market that they can tap, and started to record in the disco style. 1975 was the year in which disco broke into the mainstream. This is Gloria Gaynor, performing a disco version of Never Can Say Goodbye, originally recorded by the Jackson 5. It is part of a 1975 album by the same name, in which an entire side is one long medley. Arguably, it is the first disco album. Gloria is lip-syncing here. We are hearing the album itself. And, just like in the discotheque, we are moving seamlessly into the next track. Once again, it is a disco rendition of the Motown classic. musical basis of this disco style was the Philadelphia soul sound, a combination of funky rhythm and sweeping soul singing, mellowed with pretty melodies, string accompaniment and 60s messaging. One of the anthems of disco culture was this instrumental record by MFSB, the orchestra that played on many Philly soul records. Here, they tell us what disco wholly identified with. Love is the message. And, of course, sex is also the message. In disco, a culture that grew from a community of people who came together because of their sexual orientation, sex was an important aspect and was completely out in the open. Funky soul singers like Marvin Gaye and Barry White already turned mid-70s black music into a smoldering lava of erotica. And the disco DJs made it even more explicit. For instance, by adding Robert Plant's orgasmic moans in Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love into the mix that they created in discos. In 1975, came a record in which the funk, the technology and the orgasm were already wrapped together in the original recording.
Love to love you, baby. Love to love you, baby. Love to love you, baby.
In the late 70s, after it took the silver screens by storm with the hit movie Saturday Night Fever, a movie that in many ways negated the original disco spirit, disco started to dominate the music industry and the nightlife. The combination of danceable rhythms with pleasant melody was easy to connect with, and people of different cultures found common language on the dance floor. One of the outcomes of this crossover into the mainstream was that gay culture became more socially accepted, and gays could express their identity more freely. There were even some disco singers who found success without hiding their LGBT identity. Disco helped to ease the tensions between blacks and whites, bringing them together on the dance floor. It heralded the 80s, in which African Americans had an easier time blending in the American society. But it also symbolized their feeling that in order to belong, they have to compromise on their identity. Disco was like a diluted and whitewashed version of funk and soul, doing away with funky polyrhythms to have just one beat. In funk, there is a lot of variance in the matter of which beats get accentuated. In disco, the rhythm is what is known as 4 on the floor, a metronomic pulse in which every beat in the bar is accentuated. Just 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, over and over again. By 1979, it got on everyone's nerves. Many black kids felt that it robs their soul, and turned to hip-hop, seen as the true heir to funk. But their negative reaction to disco was nothing compared to the backlash from the white rock fans. For those who grew up on 70s rock, disco was an abomination. Instead of a singer-creator who embodies the individual's struggle against the world, disco offered mainly music made by anonymous producers. Instead of humane music based on improvisation and skill, disco sounded mechanic, with a steady beat and machine sounds. And instead of rock machoism, disco was gay. People who came from outside the disco culture didn't understand where this music was coming from, didn't understand that every record has to be taken as part of a bigger musical piece, didn't understand that it actually preserves the spirit of psychedelia. Rock fans perceived disco as music made by the industry to kill rock music, to neuter the humanity of music and turn it into a meaningless product meant for dancing. Aiding this perception was the fact that the disco formula was very easy to reproduce, and many artists who wanted a hit used it, flooding the market with mediocre records that all had the same beat, which pretty soon got on everybody's nerves. In 1979, an aggressive anti-disco backlash commenced, and in 2 years it was dead as a popular style. Whites breathed a sigh of relief that rock was saved, blacks were happy to see it gone, and disco was filed away as a fad that deserved nothing but contempt and ridicule. The ones who suffered were of course the LGBT people. Just as the US saw the rise of the Reagan administration that oppressed them in the name of family values, the counterculture also turned its back on them. In the 70s, rock was somewhat open to gayness and androgyny, through glam rock. Now, due to its hatred of disco, it became homophobic. The gays retreated into the discotheques, and there the ember of disco was kept alive for a few years, stewing in its own juices, working under the surface, waiting for a moment it can break out again. But when it finally did, it sounded different.
How about the Bee Gees? Oh, I see. Okay. Well, listen, we took all the disco records that you brought tonight. We got them in a giant box, and we're going to blow them up real good. Now, we will be returning to the scene of the crime here on the 5th of August for a day in the park with Journey and Santana. You know the whole boogie. And we'll blow up some more. Disco sucks. Disco sucks. Disco sucks.
The most notorious case of discophobia happened in 1979 in Chicago, before a baseball game between the Chicago White Sox and the Detroit Tigers. Tens of thousands of disco records were brought to the field by the fans, and burned to the cheers of the crowd, in what was dubbed the Disco Demolition Derby. However, this was not a Chicago initiative. It actually came from Detroit radio DJ Steve Dahl, who launched a crusade against disco. Detroit was a big rock, soul and funk city, and hated disco. In Chicago, although no one knew it yet, a different scene was emerging. Disco was introduced to Chicago only in 1977, when DJ Frankie Knuckles relocated there from New York. Jockeying in a club called The Warehouse, a gay black hangout, he started to diversify disco DJing techniques, developing new ways to cut and mix records, significantly changing the original recording. From 1981 onwards, a new term started to take root in Chicago: warehouse music, and soon it was shortened to simply house music. To say about a record that it was house meant that it is a novel dance record, which gives you the same feeling that Knuckles gave you in the disco. It also symbolized that it is an underground record, one that you don't hear on the radio but only in the house, that is, either in the club or at home. A little later, the name gained another meaning. In the 80s, common people already had access to home computers and other technological toys, which they could use to create their own track. Then, they could bring it to the discotheque, and if the DJs liked it, they would add it to their set. The term house then started to symbolize music that you create at your own house, with your meager means, and it gained a new sense of power and freedom. This is one of the first house hits, coming out in 1986. As we can hear, it isn't that different from disco. But soon, house produced hit records that showed its uniqueness. The house style emphasized and enhanced precisely those aspects in disco that were most maligned by the world: the repetitiveness, the 4-on-the-floor beat, the reliance on machines to create music. For rock fans, these were aspects that symbolized loss of humanity. But for the gay disco fans, these aspects were the thing that most typified disco, and thus symbolized their soul. In fact, it could be said that house removed all the respectable characteristics of disco, like the soulful singing, and left only the disdained ones. But the result was the same, an ecstatic feeling that engulfed all dancers, and turned them into a happy and loving tribe. It was aided by a new drug that was adopted by this culture, officially called MDMA, but more commonly known as ecstasy. MDMA, a stimulant that energizes the body and makes it want to shake loose and dance, also enhances your senses to perceive the novel sounds. While the outside world regarded them as people who are losing their soul to the machine, the dancers felt like they are becoming a dancing machine, and thus achieving a higher level of humanity. In the mid-80s, house was identified with the dance style called jacking, in which the body is moved in a repetitive and vigorous way, essentially turning your body into a machine. And then, by accident, everything changed. It happened thanks to a machine. The Roland TB-303 was a machine designed to provide bass accompaniment to guitar players, to help them practice. It wasn't very good, but one day in 1985, a Chicago man named Nathan Pierre Jones and two of his friends started to play with the programming, and took it to extremes, in which the bass sound was completely distorted. Suddenly, the machine started to make weird noises that didn't sound like the noises it usually makes, and yet sounded oddly familiar. There was something psychedelic about them. They realized that they have a house track, something that they made at home, and decided to add drum machines and a few more sound effects. They brought the finished product to the music box, the discotheque that was the court of DJ Ron Hardy, and he played it that very night. The initial response was negative, and the dancers cleared the dance floor. But Hardy was relentless and played the track 3 more times that night, the last time getting a response that raised the ceiling. He kept on playing it in the following nights, and the dancers, high on ecstasy and LSD, found in these bleeps something that really agreed with them. They started to call it Ron Hardy's Acid Track, and it eventually became known as Acid Tracks. Pierre and his friends didn't know it yet, but the fooling around with the Roland machine essentially brought psychedelia back to life. House took music deep into the machine, in some ways representing the mechanization of humanity. But then, deep in the bowels of the machine, a new humanity was suddenly discovered, beginning a new era in music. Soon enough, others started to make similar tracks, and a new subgenre was born, called Acid House. In Chicago, it remained marginal, and the city kept on jacking. But elsewhere around the world, it sparked a revolution. MDMA arrived in Britain in 1985 and rapidly changed the local club scene. The music that the Brits were dancing to that year didn't really fit the energies that the drug brought, but once acid house made its way to England's shores, the youth was hooked, and it blew any other style out of the dance floor. First in Ibiza, then in London and Manchester, the music that came from Chicago generated a culture that started to talk about love in the middle of the egocentric and alienated 80s. Soon enough, the Brits started to create their own acid house. By 1988, some of it even charted. As usual, the British tabloids reacted with hysteria to this new cultural phenomenon, generating a moral panic. the government started to take steps to deal with the problem. But in 1988, the kids took it all with love. When police sirens were heard, they would just dance around their police vehicles, answering the siren call with In 1988, acid house broke out of the discos as DJs started to go out of town and do their sets out in the open, while thousands of youngsters danced around them in what became known as raves. Developing an underground network that included pirate radio stations, a distribution net and even an early version of mobile phones, the ravers managed to operate under the police's nose and pass the information about the time and place of the next rave to the right people. They managed to throw several raves a week. The scenes in the raves reminded old-timers of the happy times in San Francisco a couple of decades before, and the summer of 1988 was dubbed the second summer of love. Hippie culture, as we recall, also started out as a dance culture, in the early days of the Merry Pranksters, the Grateful Dead and the Acid Tests. But the effect of European culture was still too strong, and it made psychedelia turn towards music that was meant for the mind alone, believing that this is what serious music should be about. Funk, and then disco, liberated us from this European tradition, and taught us that ecstatic experiences are best achieved when dancing. And then came rave, and took psychedelia back to its origins. The raves looked a lot like the acid tests of the Merry Pranksters, with the multicolored glowing outfits and the dazzling light show. Only now it was on a larger scale, with more sophisticated technological means. This could not be killed. Another area in which rave went back to its psychedelic roots was in reliance on technology. Since psychedelia shifted the emphasis from the formal beauty of the melody to the exoticism of the lone sound, there was need for instruments that create otherworldly sounds. In the 60s, many musicians explored the sounds that could be produced with electric instruments and studio technology, but the plethora of sounds one could produce was limited. In the 2 decades that passed, electronic instruments advanced, and many musicians, especially in Europe, explored all the ways in which they could be used. They produced an endless variety of miraculous sounds, which made their way into disco and new wave, and from there to house, techno and rave. The visuals have also made a huge progress, and the combination of home computers and the endless equations of chaos theory enabled the dance clubs to create ravishing and ever-changing visuals. In the late 80s, the clubs and the raves promoted themselves with colorful posters reminiscent of psychedelia, with the aesthetics that were taken from the late 60s, but could be done better with new technology. Another style that was developed in the 70s and relied on technology is ambient, which we mentioned in part 12. Ambient, which used synthesizers to create dreamy soundscapes, sprang from the wish to create quality background music to replace muzak. It remained a marginal genre in pop, without much significance, but when the rave revolution came, it suddenly gained a new meaning. After they would dance for hours, many of the dancers needed rest, and the clubs dedicated a special room which I called the chill room, where you could relax and sink into entrancing ambient music while you recuperate. The style was called chill out music, and many artists started to work in the field.
Naughty, very naughty.
In the early 90s, there were also those who managed to condense the ecstasy of rave music into 3 minutes and create pop hits. One of the leading bands was The Shamen, which provided many anthems to the new culture. Their most famous record is about a bloke named Ebenezer Good, who is described as the man behind the scene, the one responsible for making all of us dance, love and be happy. Who is this Ebenezer Good? The chorus provides the answer, with a pun that says, "He's a good." That is, ecstasy pills are good, and they are the source of our happiness. Why this worship of MDMA? Well, we already mentioned its stimulating effect on the body, which makes it an ideal drug for dancers. But it has another effect. From the beginning, those who tried it noted the change that it causes in how you view other people, how it makes you become friendlier and more empathic. In rave culture, it was known as a love drug, and the claim was that it makes you love the people around you, and was the thing responsible for the camaraderie within the scene. In my humble opinion, they got it wrong. Drugs cannot make you love. We have seen camaraderie in other subcultures using different drugs, or no drugs at all. MDMA does lower your guards, and makes you more affected by the feelings of those around you. It also makes you want to transcend your boundaries. But this is not love. The love that the rave kids felt happens when a group of people unite around a common experience, which makes them feel like they share a common destiny, and that they are working together to make the world better. It's the same feeling that we find in the early psychedelic scene, in the early disco scene, and so forth.
Porque es la bomba que va a estallar, no tiene pegas porque es genial, así me gusta a mí, así me gusta a mí, así me gusta a mí, así me gusta a mí.
And the way that society treated these kids was also similar to what those other cultures had to deal with early on. The British press printed horror stories about the demonic power of the ecstasy drug that turns your children into a tribe of dancing savages, and the authorities declared war on the drug and on the music. Eventually, it became illegal to gather to listen to music that was dominated by repetitive electronic beats, and people were locked up for organizing raves. The original culture was repressed, and in the early 90s, it became hard to find a rave in the British Isles. But all this negative publicity, of course, only made the culture more appealing to those who didn't want to live a bourgeois life and be a part of the system. New players started to join the game, including some who were actually old players. In Britain there were still some hippies around, still doing their thing since the 60s, living life on the road, moving from place to place and throwing concerts and parties. The most important band on the scene was Hawkwind, which combined space rock with good old-fashioned rock and roll. Some ravers regarded Hawkwind as spiritual ancestors. The British cities also had people who lived outside the system, and they would illegally squat in abandoned buildings. These people connected to the more urban punk, which gave expression to their anti-establishment spirit. While the original punks, like the Sex Pistols, spoke of anarchy only as an experience, there were also punks who took the anarchy into more political and existential directions, and found a base of support among the squatters. Like the original punks, they too hated the hippies, but in the 80s, when the conservative government clamped down and drove them away from the cities, they connected to the vagabond hippies, and found shared destiny. The two previously hostile subcultures got together to form the identity of the crusty, someone who lives outside the capitalist system. The subculture, also called travelers, was hounded by the authorities, but they continued to roam the land, meet in predetermined locations, and throw concerts and parties. Since they came out of rock, they always despised disco and everything that came out of it. But when rave started, they finally realized that this music is the true heir to psychedelia, and got on the new bus. The leading band on this scene was Spiral Tribe. During the 90s, the culture that started with rave split into many different styles. House, techno, trance, garage, dancehall, drum and bass and countless other subgenres explored the possibilities of electronic dance music. What started in one discotheque in Chicago became a global culture, split into dozens of different tribes, each with its own worldview, each with its own way of putting together sounds, beats and visuals to create ecstasy and joy. The most psychedelic of them all is the style known as psychedelic trance, but they all have traces of psychedelia in their DNA. The story of electronic dance music is a different story, much bigger than the story of psychedelia. It is a story for another time. But the fans should know, at the basis of every one of the styles that you dance to, buried deep, lies the seed that was planted then, years ago, by Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. Without them, you would not exist.